peoples and with stories, and I uphold my responsibility to my community. I've been at the museum for 10 years, and through fellowships I've been able to travel across the world and connect with ancestral belongings from the UK to Rome to the United States. I have seen our objects. For some of them I've been the first Aboriginal person to connect with them since they were taken from country. When I leave for a trip, I often think about something an elder of mine, a traditional owner of Melbourne, Auntie Carolyn Briggs, once said to me. What is in the heavens is reflected on the earth. We must try to understand what's in between. This calling of the in-between and our ancestral belongings is what I'm still trying to understand. So before I go any further, I must begin this storyline with who I am and where I come from. I'm a Yorta Yorta woman. My ancestral country is in the south of Australia. The Dungala River, the Murray River is very important to our people. My position within the institution I work for is both that of an employee, but it runs much deeper. I have photos of my family in the collection, photos of my grandparents, my grandmothers, my aunts and uncles, and currently on display is a dress of my grandmother's. I come from a family of activists and teachers and people just trying to survive. It has its roots in Yorta Yorta country and extends to Mauritius and Chennai, with my great-grandfather Thomas Shadrach James having in India many years ago. Country. He was a teacher and a doctor and a political activist, and that's up on the top right-hand side there. My great-uncle was an activist and political leader. My great-nan Becky, a matriarch of the community until her death in 1986. I could go on and on, but we'll be here all day, and I stand on the shoulders of giants. I start here to begin a storyline approach that is to ground my presentation in time and place. It is a teaching pedagogy my uncle Wayne developed on country learning for many years, and it's also been instilled in me growing up. This is where you begin with your roots. And the photos here are from the Museum Victoria collection that I work for. It's my grandmother here, my grandmother with Grandpa James, the mission that my family were put on. You can ask me questions later. The beginning of my international research came from wanting to connect with objects that are displaced from country, to understand their role within the institutions, how they engaged with, both from the curatorial perspective and the keepers of these collections, but also more importantly, the sovereign peoples who have connected and responded with new works to these old belongings. This need to connect and understand has led me to places like the British Museum, to the smallest of country museums in the middle of England. It's led me to empires like the Smithsonian and to Rome in what I could only describe as a mausoleum for our cultural materials. Here I have seen objects from many nations. I have seen objects that we no longer have in Australia, and I have seen things that should be home. I have also seen things that should never be seen. It has led me to question our histories and the current status of colonisation, both in our homelands, but also in the diaspora of cultural belongings overseas. How this repetition of trauma, the longer these objects remain dislocated from their peoples, will cycle. This dislocation is strengthened by the non-Indigenous experts researching, writing their books and journal articles on our cultural material and experiences, both past and present. There have been thousands of photos I've taken and hundreds of objects I've seen from these experiences, and I've become more and more interested in how the collection legacy of the ethnographic museum space has influenced the contemporary art space today, and to critically look at curatorial practice also within these spaces. What links the collection of our materials and ancestral human remains, and the way that our culture has been catalogued and defined by the institutions, to the way it has continued to be written about, or into or out of the canon, and how has this influenced the methodologies of acquisition and representation of our culture? These are all the things that are going through my mind constantly. My first questions when I started visiting these places were, where are our people's voice of today? Why aren't we considered as intellectual equals within these spaces with the white anthropologist or art historian? And what makes Indigenous knowledge less valid than our non-Indigenous peers in the museum, university or white cube space? But now I actually question, do we want to be equals? Do we strive for this? I think we should strive, and have been for a long time, our own spaces, our own ways of being and doing in galleries and museums or cultural centres, whatever that may look like. A space for us and by us. And as Yamatji curator Stephen Gilchrist has stated, we need to create space for indigeneity, not of indigeneity. It has fueled my fire to pursue self-determination within these spaces, to remove the pen from the hand of the anthropologist and pass it to my community and to my elders. My uncle always says, which came from Grandpa James, use the spear of the pen. Entering into the institution has led me to think about my sovereignty and my identity. The digging sticks of my matriarchs once held, the stone tools of my ancestors used, have they laid in front of me in London or Rome? Maybe. The drawers that close and the plastics that cover our objects also suffocate me. I lament when the time comes and my visit ends and I have to cover them again. I say goodbye and that I will be back for them. And it haunts me that I may not be able to keep that promise. My first experience in an international collection was at the British Museum. I also went to Pitt Rivers, Oxford University, Cambridge Museum. I went to Tate Liverpool, Serpentine Gallery, the Museum of Transatlantic Slavery, to also look at community-driven projects and artistic interventions within the archive. One ancestral belonging was at the British Museum. It's the most prized trophy of the British Museum from Australia. It sits within the Room of Enlightenment. Missing from home for 250 years, this is the Gweagle Shield, taken by Captain Cook and Joseph Banks on the first landing. As I stood there, it was as if a bullet went through my heart. I physically felt something shift in my body. I looked closer and there was a bullet hole piercing its heart too. This long, proud shield is the first item ever taken from the First Peoples of Australia by the Western world. It was first thing taken along with spears and other items from the camp that Cook and Banks intruded upon. Cook and his crew were to record the transit of Venus, but Cook's secret mission and desire was Terra Australis, the Great Southern Land. This monument of bearing witness to its magnificence, this moment of bearing witness to its magnificence quickly ended as I was hurled through a storyline of time and my own existence, standing in front of the shield in the middle of London at the British Museum. I saw 250 years of taking our objects, writing about our culture, extracting knowledge and regurgitating it within the white paradigm. The awe of everything around me soon turned to anger. And just to note that it's 250 years this year that Cook left on his voyage to track the transit of Venus, 248 years since he landed on our country. On this trip I also researched material at Cambridge University, who have a mass of southeastern material and also material collected by Cook and Banks. This is me in the collections. When I walk into these spaces, I'm usually presented just with tables just covered in objects that have been in the zoological collection or something else racially insensitive. So a very old handwritten object label started me on this journey of thinking about the influence of these histories and the influence that they have on art today. Notions of authenticity and the expectations of what our art and cultural practice should be stem from the colonial gathering and storing of our objects. This object here was at Cambridge University, and this old handwritten label read, "A good specimen of a parrying shield, but the value of by some degree impaired by having incised by the white man's tool. The colouring is white man's material, as the blacks had no such colour as blue." This states, for me, it kind of was a moment that it states that the authentic is only that of an object which is unimpaired by the white man's tool, denying the cultural knowledge of making, the significance of line and skill base passed on for 65 or more thousand years. At this moment I saw evidence in the legacy of this one simple comment that has a ripple effect today. What is authentic? Who is authentic? More recently, I returned and spent time with belongings kept in an old warehouse in the burbs of London. Full of emu feather skirts and shields and baskets, and also a bark from the Jaja Wurrung people, which is extremely rare. It's the only one in the world. I thought of my cousins, my Jaja Wurrung cousins, as I held this shield. How much time have I got? 15 minutes. 15, okay. So this is again in the British Museum's store. We cannot progress our realities until we acknowledge our past histories, and this is something that's been a problem with museums, particularly in Australia, for many years. The histories of these institutions are not understood or widely known. It is often not known how collections were acquired, including ancestral remains. We continue to be designated within the canon of retrospective nostalgia within the historical past. It has been void of Aboriginal voice, and for some of these places continue to reinscribe the colonial other narrative through non-Indigenous curators still holding the key to apparently unlocking our history, perpetuating the convenient lie of cultural loss, that being knowledge or craftsmanship, object dormancy, the object being asleep, and inscribing Western ideas of authenticity. This is problematic as it has a ripple effect into the art discourse, contemporary acquisition and the market, where there is an expectation of what Aboriginal art should be, which is commonly what looks authentic enough to pass as antiquity, or the value of Aboriginal art based on a Western desert or northern form that is appealing and approved Aboriginal aesthetic. Which I must add that, you know, these are contemporary works as well, and just as relevant as our urban-based community. The ripple effect continues into art history in the critic space, where white men seem to dominate and continue to question our space within the contemporary canon, or neglect to include strong voices of Aboriginal curators and writers who have been writing and advocating and creating for decades. And John is one of these people, and I must acknowledge him in this space. Belief in the dormancy of a collection is something I witnessed at the USA in 2015 when I was a resident at Klugeroo Aboriginal Collection in Virginia. I was at the Smithsonian of Natural History, and I was there to see Southeastern material again. This material, there's a couple of hundred objects from New South Wales and Victoria, and it was actually part of the foundation collection for the Smithsonian Institute. So they went out in 1840 and they collected to begin that institute's collection. So these are some of the earliest collections from Australia as well. Although all of the objects are precious, I was there to see one in particular, a possum skin cloak. This possum skin cloak is the oldest in existence. Our cloaks kept us warm and dry. We had them from birth. They remained with us until death. That's when we were wrapped in our cloaks, and they were designed with our maps of country and markers of identity. The curator of the Oceanic collection was most accommodating. However, her work in the institution of nearly 40 years had been focused on Papua New Guinea. And although being the keeper of the Australian collection over the many years she had been at the Smithsonian, she had not done any work on it. And when I was going through, it was almost as if it was the first time she was seeing this collection as well. She allowed me to see everything and spend whatever time I needed, touch if I wanted. And the cloak was stacked at the bottom of many other cloaks from across the world. This is that cloak. These are extremely rare. There's 3 historical cloaks left in the world. There's fragments in other places. And they continue to be a practice that we do today. I spent time alone and I sat on the floor to be close to the old one. For something that we practice is deep listening in my language. It's Gulpa Nawal. I studied the lines, the sewing, I breathed in the stale smell of old things, and I spoke to it. When it was time to go, the curator closed the drawer and said softly, "Time to go back to sleep now." I was startled by this comment. It came from care, like a grandmother tucking in her grandchild, but it deeply disturbed me because I wondered if it was going to sleep. when will be the next time it was going to wake up? It was the notion that all of the objects were sleeping and dormant that made my heart ache. I've written before about the awakening of the collection, however, my thoughts of this have changed now. I actually believe they are still awake and perhaps just recharged and given comfort when community are near them, but there is also a reciprocal channel that is opened when connecting and strengthening, when connecting to these objects that strengthens the person. I asked the curator about the question, which is usually the big white elephant in the room, repatriation, and I was quickly shut down. Because of these objects to the American history are far too important to ever let them go home. I just wanted to comment here that the practice of cloak making is still very much alive, and I've worked very closely with a Kure Burung Gurichamara woman called Vicky Cousins, who is an incredible artist. She has been instrumental in the revival of cloak making in Australia, and this actually came from a moment that she had with a historical cloak in our collection from her country, which is the illustration on the side here. Out of respect, I'm not showing a photo of that. And this item comes from 1852. Vicky has connected with that and gone on to revive the making of cloaks. She's also pulled many of the designs that are maps of her country and used them in different ways. And in the museum we have a beautiful big rug that is our welcome rug for people in the cultural centre, Aboriginal Cultural Centre, that Vicky designed based on a design from the old cloak. This is her here. I'm showing some artists, and I encourage you to write them down and Google them. Last year I had the opportunity to go to Berlin, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and do a bit of a collection research tour across the UK and Europe. And I'm still understanding my calling into this place, but I felt in some way I was exactly where I should be and getting closer to what I don't even know I'm really looking for. For the first time in international collections, I held objects from my country. I began in Rome at the Pigarini Museum, and I found objects there, looked at objects there that were from my country, stone tools and boomerangs and things I'd not seen before. I went on to Berlin, and Berlin was a fascinating place with the Museum of Ethnography. I was there to meet a colleague, and we were looking at material from William Blandowski, who was the first curator of the museum, but I was also there to see the other material. And there was two very special objects, and one is said to come from also Cook and Joseph Banks in that first voyage, a stolen shield and a boomerang. The museum are currently insisting that it's not likely from Cook. However, they've not made a conclusive comment either way. Its registry book states it's from Cook, taken at Botany Bay. There are other signs that it points to this. I felt at the time it was a convenient stance to deny this history, particularly because of the situation at the British Museum and the request for repatriation of that. So this is the shield, and I just wanted to read out quickly a little thing from my personal journal that I was there. When I saw the Cook shield, my heart skipped a beat. Sitting there in the clinical trolley, its strength beamed back at me. It is full of memory and power. As I touched it and picked it up, I spoke to it silently, saying hello, who I was, and paying respect. I studied every crack and crevice, the white ochre just visible in places, the red still just there. How striking it must have been, a warrior shield. I feel guilty having to leave it. And this is just the documentation from Botany Bay. We went on into the collections, and walking down those halls, and many smells and many energies were amongst that space, and I focused on what was ahead of me. As I walked in to see the Australian collection, the curator opened the cabinet, and it was really a startling moment. There was clubs and walking sticks and boomerangs and lots of things all strung up on butcher's hooks. I think she noticed my look of horror and said to me, "Oh, it's a space-saving technique." But I'm not sure what disturbed me the most, the way in which our objects were housed, or the fact that some of these items are the most extremely rare and earliest collections in the world that not many people know about or have been able to connect with. There was a possum skin cloak there. I asked if they had anything, from possums, and she pulled out this, which is a small cloak that had been cut up and put onto a board. I'd also seen a photo of a necklace that was registered as Western Australian. However, looking at it closely, I identified it as Victorian. It had also been collected by Eugene von Gerard, who was the first curator of the National Gallery of Victoria, who had also collected the rest of the Victorian material, including a huge amount of, because it was recognised that without the community and our voice and our histories and these stories to go with the object, I think it can extend into art as well, and visual art in galleries. It doesn't mean much unless you know a little bit about it, particularly with our ancestral material, I think. So that has been something that has really influenced me, and being a part of that as a junior, I must add, in that space, to be a part of something like that.
I'm very curious, thank you very much for your presentation, of course. I'm very curious to understand more this space of visibility and invisibility with which you started. And since yesterday maybe we touched a little bit upon a different kind of terminology which is needed also in the space of art. And in your practice, it seems that certain objects have been taken from their space, and also you work with this object in a different space, which create a different space of visibility. I wonder how you work in these spaces in between, and also how do you go from one space to the other, and what does that mean, also in your everyday life? Because of course the museum is an absolute space of a space where certain meanings is completely transformed, but also anesthetized somehow. So I wonder how you cross those spaces.
I suppose, I think, as I said earlier, I see myself working in a space of culture. So I've tried to unlearn, and decolonise my mind in terms of what I learnt at university, and since being in the institution and then out of the institution. And actually acknowledging that I work within a space of culture, whether that be a video work that I curate into a show, in a contemporary art space, or a shield from 1860 that was stolen, and my approach is always to include the voices of community now, and to ensure that people know that we are living, and that these objects mean something to us right now. So I don't know, but crossing the boundaries, I guess I've been lucky because I've been supported to do that as well. I also just don't really care what people think, and I go ahead and do it anyway. So there's a little bit of that might come into it, and I'm still learning. I've been very lucky that people have paved the way for me in institutions like Judy Watson, who is an artist but had been working, in the British Museum and places like that decades ago. And there's many others, I won't name them all now, but I'm just sort of following in their footsteps. And I was saying to David earlier, just making sure that I acknowledge that, but also that I'm in a time and place now where I may be able to look at things differently or have different opportunities that they did. So I suppose that is the in-between space as well, in the time and place we're at now.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have been thinking about this because the phenomenon of this type of collections is that they have been taken from one context and then put in another context. So it somehow echoes the relationship between a text and a context. so that we could imagine that the object is a text that was from one context and then put into the museum context. And there are many interesting things that then appear. For example, many of the objects are either robbed or stolen. And when somebody is the guardian of some stolen goods, then I can imagine that they are very very apologetic about the robbery and how it was acquired in the first place. And then if you then ask, could I have that back? And then they will say that, but you should, but we need our collection, or they have a pretty rational justification. We have had a special case in Tromsø where there were collected like 5,000 yoiks, and the yoiks have been pagan songs, and they have been stigmatized through different dimensions of stigmatization. And but they have managed to get a collection of 5,000. The thing with the yoik is that it's if somebody gets to hear it, then it won't disappear from the collection. And then it is so interesting to hear the justification for not letting the yoiks out, because that's what Tromsø Museum does. They say that we can't let those genies out of the bottle. And that sort of maybe tells that there are different layers in this apologetic approach, that to get back the objects would be a much more difficult process than one can get the impression of when asking, could I have this object back? This belongs to my great-grandmother.
I think, it's very complex, and it's not just because I may have simplified it a bit too much in terms of going in and asking if I can have it back, because I certainly don't just go in like that. I wish it was as simple as that sometimes, but I've had a lot of thought around this, and we have these conversations all the time in my backyard around our objects and our stories and our things coming home, and what's the benefit of some of them staying there? Is there a benefit of that? Where do they come home when they do come home? But I'd also like to see the role of makers and artists and community, and people going into, I mean, we need to do it in our own institutions in Australia, but it has been happening, but going into these places like the British Museum, maybe that's not the first place to start, but Oxford, for instance, that have a huge amount of Victorian material that I know from Gunditjmara people, and supporting artists to go into that space themselves, because I'm very lucky I've had the opportunity to go in and connect and to see, and then to bring those photos back to my community and talk with them. But I'd like to see artists going into these spaces and an exchange happening. So perhaps we can be making a new cloak and exchange that for the old cloak. I mean, it's not simple, but to start and support our people going into these spaces, that's something I'd like to be doing. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of answers, but yeah, it's one idea.
Thank you, Kimberley. That's really fantastic, and I think I applaud you for this thing that you're doing, because I think it's a great way to retell the story. And as you say, as I hear you speak, you're very much in on this journey to look at paradigms and how paradigms need to change. My question is one for whether or not you've come across internal strife between the various indigenous people in this kind of collection. In other words, you know, rather than flattening it to say that this is about them, we and them, somebody collected us, took us, you know, one's white, one's not white. You know, along the ways, there must have been a practice, I would think, and I'm checking with you, to see whether or not there was strife internally within the indigenous peoples, that things were taken. In other words, there was a kind of a middleman or a broker or something in between, that things were acquired that way. As you know, in some cultures, when a warfare happens, the winner takes things. And those things, did you come across anything like that, which is another layer of this paradigm?
We have an object at the museum that I work for, which comes from a conflict, but it's from a massacre. And the massacre happened at Avoca in Victoria. That's from the conflict between the settlers, the white settlers, and the Jajawarang people that were shot and killed, women, children, you know, men. And that shield was dropped at that massacre, and the museum collected that. There are thousands of objects like that across the world that come from that conflict. And no, nothing's been collected that I know of from internal fighting from our people. It's come from the oppression and the massacring and the displacement of our people by the settlers. So that's the conflict that I see within these collections. Not the conflict of our peoples between each other, but the frontier war and the immense genocide that was inflicted, on our people. So that's an example of an object from that time.
But isn't it rather one-sided? I mean, that's an important story, but that's one story. And I'm asking, I don't know the history and all the stories. I'm just thinking that surely there must have been other conflicts where other things were actually collected and then passed on. The internal conflicts is what I'm looking for. I mean,
well, I'm not
intra-tribe.
I don't think. Well, we're talking about the trade in ethnographic objects held by museum collections overseas. There may well be objects like the ones you're talking about, but I've never seen them. The trade in ethnographic objects begins in 1770 with Cook, and conflicts arise over the trade of those ethnographic objects. That's what Kimberley is talking about.
And thank you, Daniel. And just, you know, the point I was trying to make also with my tongue-in-cheek, I'm your Venus, is that object from Captain Cook, it's from Dharawal Gweagal people, that was collected by Captain Cook, is that first moment of stolen goods. And that, as Daniel just said, is the first moment of conflict. Yes, there is material in collections that were collected in other ways from missionaries that were robbing our people of culture and Christianizing us and putting us, onto missions, and they were taking our objects then. There were anthropologists and amateur collectors taking our objects because we were seen as a dying race, and these were evidence of that. And the photo that I showed you before in terms of the impaired by the white man's tool, that's a perfect example of the mindset of those people at that time as well. So these are the histories. And I must say that even if there was trade, and maybe that was of sugar or rum or tea for our objects, that is not a collection, that is not an ethical collecting history. The power balance at that time was never the same, so it can never be an ethical collecting history. So that's my comment. Thank you.
first I must acknowledge your courage to, to be able to say that that kind of established institution, to say the repatriation, that actually, I think you did something that did stabilize their, ground. I think this is the first subversion, and it has to continue. And second one is there's a more question. I was so fascinated by this 2015 exhibition you have mentioned. 2015 exhibition with like Maori and Australians and
the conference, last year.
Yeah, something like that. And I was also imagining, I would like to imagine more, interchange from, say, Sami people and from the south, north to south, this collaboration. And I, of course, thank Oka for being able to see this. I also didn't know much about anything. And is there any imagination? Are we imagining, to do this, to bring, north to south collaboration of indigenous people? I don't know. I don't know yet. But like some in this forum, somebody might know. Or
like as in a museum of.
Yes.
I don't know. But I must say, actually, I left off that there were Sami people there last year as well. I must acknowledge that, and I was there as part of a Tri-Nations curatorial program, which brings together Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Sami people. And at that time, there was a bunch of curators travelling around and sharing practice and there for that conference. But it's interesting. Maybe that is a future for one of our futures.
I would also like to invite everybody to see the work of Indigenous artists in this exhibition. Please have a look, and there might be, more possibilities, and imagination will open up. And we don't have any curator from here. We don't have any curatorial experience in this part of the world. So there is big possibilities. Thank you.
I just want to comment more than anything else how it's really amazing. Your work is really extensive and incredibly, must be incredibly emotionally draining to see all that. It's like seeing someone in prison somewhere a long way away. I've been seeing some collections like Berlin, etc., and that's the feeling that you want to take that thing with you. You find it, you think, what are you doing here? And you want to take it back. There's a very famous film about the Terra Australis Islander collections, and Efren Barney was watching this mask. He's showing this mask, and he's looking there in adoration at this thing, and he actually picks it up and holds it, like you would hold a person. And this voice says, "I told you not to touch that," which is the person there with white gloves on behind him, or something like that. It's just so funny, and that finishes the film. What really astounds you, though, and you would have more experience of this in my own experience, is that there's these enormous collections, and it's like they're in junk houses. People have all these huge collections. They're never going to show them anywhere.
No.
And like you said, they've got, the comment is, this is damaged, it's badly damaged, etc. It's inauthentic. You think, well, why don't you just give it back?
Exactly.
It's just stupid. You're never going to do anything with it. So it is almost like you have a captive. It's held captive. And it's because of that power, they're holding power over you. I have something you want, and I won't give it back to you. How do you hold people under your control? You torture them. That's one way, or something out of 1984. How do you get people to obey you? You torture them, and they're torturing us, and torturing that person, that object in bodies, and that's how it's always struck me. People would say, look, we have these things here, we have some Aboriginal things here. And you try to work out why is it, why, how do they get here? Tragic comment. When I worked for a certain national, we were building some new national institution. We had a meeting amongst the curators. The main point of our database on the computers, what would be the first point of entry? And I said, well, of course, the name of the Aboriginal person who made it. And then this huge argument then started, oh no, it has to be the collector. It has to be the white collector. And we almost came to blows over it. And it was just ridiculous. And I think there's still, I left that place by police, etc. In the colonial conflict. It wasn't complete, but it was pretty extensive, and it was a rare document for that time. And there was a Danish researcher came to Australia just in the last 10 years, and he came to find out what this man was doing. So he then completed that documentation of how many people were actually murdered in the colonial process. Yeah. And he's come up with these figures that I was talking about yesterday, about there are more people killed in Queensland alone than all the Australians in the First World War. All the Australian soldiers in the First World War, there were more Aboriginal people murdered in Queensland, and by non-Aboriginal people, than Australians in the whole First World War. Yeah. That's the other thing. Yeah.
Can I just say something? Half a minute. Just piece of information. This very academy has a room which started archiving materials from the indigenous peoples. This, like when I visited that event, it prompted me. I'll maybe talk about it tomorrow. And I'm just somewhat in between the human zoo phenomenon. There are also museums in Bangladesh and other parts of South Asia which represents different communities. You may see it, like it's quite interesting. The Tripuras, the Chakmas. Okay.
Well, Kimberley, you really sparked off wonderful discussion.
Sorry, just following up on that question.
Could you come to the mic?
I don't want to be overly critical, but in sort of listening to your presentation, it seems as if museum practice and this kind of collecting practice exists only in the West, whereas around the world, including in Bangladesh, but particularly, for example, in Japan, you have these gigantic collections of indigenous objects. How do you deal with those histories, and how do you take those apart? Of course, we know that there's a huge ethnographic museum in Berlin, which is viciously collected these objects in America, in Europe, but then we tend to forget that over here in the global south and other parts of the world are as complicit in this and are even less open to these kinds of questions.
Well, I suppose acknowledging that absolutely, but I'm speaking from my perspective as an Aboriginal woman from Australia, which 100% focuses on my people from Australia, and I acknowledge that I also don't have a lot of knowledge around what you're talking about over here as well. Yeah.
But I mean, just these objects. I mean, I've seen them in collections in Delhi, in Chennai, and you mentioned that your ancestors had a history of traveling to India as well. So I mean, these are very important connections as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. Well, my grandfather was from India. Yeah, they are important connections, and I think me being here as well, and my world being expanded to this place, and also meeting Indigenous peoples from Bangladesh has been incredibly valuable because I will now inform myself further in these spaces. Absolutely. Thank you.
Just to add to your, glad that you.
Sorry.
That was a fiery discussion. Fantastic. if you allow me, I just want to say one thing, because I really want to ask you this maybe later to go into greater detail. But in the case of Sápmi, there is a lot of quite an amount of restitution going on at the moment. But that brings another question. There are a series of museums in Sápmi which came up, in the 80s, and Ande, you know so much more about this than I do. But I ask myself, these museums were built to replicate exactly the Norwegian museums in every single form and way. And their conservation systems are conservation systems which are Norwegian conservation systems. They're museums which are directed by Sami peers. Unfortunately, they're still regulated within the Norwegian system. So I have to ask the question, perhaps this is something for later discussion. When restitution does happen, or even when we're thinking about acquisitions with contemporary artists from indigenous communities, what are those structures that, there's so much replication, and are we questioning enough what those new structures should be? And in Sápmi, a new museum hopefully one day will come for the Sami Artist Collection. We've been having a lot of really fascinating discussions. What should that museum look like? In the past, there's been a lot of thinking, well, we want to make it exactly as strong and powerful as the National Museum in Oslo. But the question now is, what are the new structures? And should they be reflecting so many important aspects of the Sami value system and perspectives? So I'm sorry for that indulgence, but it was burning inside me. Kimberley, thank you very, very much, and a warm hand of applause for you. So we now have the great pleasure to welcome Santosh Kumar Das, who will offer us, I'm sure, a really beautiful presentation.